And welcome to the program. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Monday through Friday, 12 to 3, really, on live on YouTube and on all the subscribing platforms. My guest this segment is Art Bell. Art is the author of the memoir Constant Comedy: How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor, which will be due to arrive on your bookshelf and at Amazon Books in September of this year. Art, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Art, let's talk a little bit about your story because this is really an autobiography. Um, let's go right to the very beginning. How did you get involved with Comedy Central? What is your background with that?
Well, my background was never in comedy. The way I started this whole thing was I was really a comedy nerd as a kid. You know, read Mad Magazine, National Lampoon, listened to all the records, Robert Klein and, Lenny Bruce. Really was almost a student of comedy when I was in high school. And when I got out of school, I thought, am I going to pursue entertainment and television? And the answer was no. So I went to work somewhere else as an economist, as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
And then I decided a couple of years later, this isn't working for me. I got to get back into television or into television.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up at HBO after that. But at HBO, I was not anywhere near programming.
Now, just as a little aside, because I think you and I are probably about the same age, and that is that I think back in the maybe early to mid 60s, there was a lot of very popular comedy records. Alan Sherman comes to mind.
Hello, mother, hello, father.
I love that. But that seems to have gone by the wayside. I mean, there doesn't seem to be, in a way, comedy seems to now be somewhat reserved to either the late night talkers who will invite comedians on, or Comedy Central, where you have the skits and you've got some filming with stand up. But it doesn't seem to quite reach the across the a crossover like it once did.
You're talking about now, the way the situation is now. It's really hard for me to comment. I will say this. I have kids who are in their 20s, and they are always dragging me to the TV and saying, Dad, you got to watch this. It's fabulous. When they're talking about Gary Goldman, for example, and,
right.
The comics that are popular today that they've discovered on their own. And on top of that, they're always on YouTube or, anywhere on the net.
Yeah. I think that is where anyone 20 and under is where they are, right? I mean, they'll cruise YouTube and then they'll go from there to other sites. And but so you started Comedy Central and you began programming there. Talk about Comedy Central.
Well, I didn't really finish your last question.
Go right ahead.
The way I got to Comedy Central is this. I love comedy. So when I got to HBO, I started pitching the idea of a 24-hour comedy channel because basically I had no idea why there wasn't one. I mean, it was in the 90s, there were lots of new channels starting up. I thought, gotta be a comedy channel. So I pitched the channel and they said it was a bad idea. Too expensive, nobody would watch it. I just constantly got shunted aside. Mm-hmm. But as luck would have, one day I ended up in the chairman's office, and I knew the chairman loved comedy, so I pitched him. And he said, that's kind of interesting. Why don't you do a feasibility study and get back to me in a few months, which I did. He liked it. We launched Comedy Channel. A year later, we merged with a competitive channel that had been launched after us by MTV Networks called Ha. And then we became Comedy Central.
And from there, it's sort of the history took care of itself. Were you, how intimately were you involved in the programming element there?
Well, from the beginning, as soon as Comedy Channel was launched, I was in programming. And there were many aspects of programming. One was acquiring product movies and older television shows. And the second was the live programming. And that was really overseen by Stu Smiley, mm-hmm. who had been the head of comedy at HBO.
Now, were you involved? I mean, was there scouting being done? Like, did you go out to Second City or different comedy clubs to try to see who was out there, sort of the way baseball works?
Yeah, it is sort of the way baseball works because there are scouts, and I wasn't
Right,
a scout, I was a programming exec.
right.
So the scouts tended to be a little bit younger, right out of college, smart kids, and they had a passion for staying up between 11 and 4 in the morning when the comics
Mm.
were doing what they do at the clubs. So that's really how we got access to new talent.
And that's really how most comedians start out. I mean, I know that even Jay Leno started out here near where I am in Boston. I think he was in Lowell and working local comedy clubs. I remember when he did that. And then from there, it's kind of the place for the comedian to build their chops, right? To kind of try out material and then move up.
Yeah, the early stages of being a stand-up comic are tough because you're trying to get to 5 or 6 or 7 minutes of good material, and you're rewriting it and reworking it and trying everything you can to make it good and better. And it takes a while. It's not like you get up there the first day and kill.
Oh, I mean, I can imagine it's extremely difficult to actually get up and figure out what it is that would make someone laugh or someone be entertained, right? I mean, it's one thing to do a talk show where you can talk about news, but to get an audience, I mean, it's almost like a way of thinking, and it's also has everything to do, I think, with body language and with the use of the pause. I mean, Jack Benny, of course, was the master of that, right? I mean,
Yeah, there's a lot of your audience who has no idea who Jack Benny is.
right.
But let me say this. I mean, you're it's not that you're overanalyzing it, but you're kind of overanalyzing it. You got to remember the people who get up there are people who are considered funny to begin with.
Hmm.
I mean, these are people who were the class clowns and getting thrown out of class all the time. These are the ones who were, entertaining people at parties with jokes or routines or whatever they wanted to do when they were in high school. So it's not like, uh, for example, you could say, hey, you know what, today I'm going to be a stand-up comedian. Wonder how that works. It really is taken on by people who think they have some real talent in it or for it, and they do. I mean, they're able to stand up there and tell the kind of thing, tell the jokes, or do the routines they've been kind of doing since they were kids, and see if they work.
And also, I think a comedian has to know a certain genre of their audience, culturally speaking, like they have to be tuned into that. I mean, an example of that might be Jerry Seinfeld and his thing. I mean, the show about nothing, right? It kind of captured a time and a
I
way
think
of thinking.
that's absolutely right. I mean, that's why one of the reasons that show was so successful. The other reason was the incredible talent involved in that show.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
amazing.
I saw the first time I saw Jerry Seinfeld, I was working at HBO. I think it was 1986 or 1987, and it was in a small place in Minneapolis, and I happened to be sitting next to his manager. And Jerry did 45 minutes of material that absolutely destroyed the audience. I mean, people were sliding off their chairs. They were laughing so hard. And it was a pretty mixed audience because I was there for work, and there were affiliates and advertisers, people of all ages and stuff. But he really had a broad appeal. And I turned to his manager and I said, if I could buy stock in a comedian, I'd buy this kid. And he said, it's too late because people already knew or were starting to know who Jerry Seinfeld was and what he could do. I think he had a very broad appeal, has a
He
very broad
did,
appeal.
and he crossed over, but in a way, his comedy was making fun of the banal. I mean, he would do an hour talking about lint in a washing machine, or how food is placed on a plate. I mean, and it captured something, I think, that was going on in the culture. Um, Also, comedians traditionally are the court jesters. I mean, this is a tradition that goes back to medieval times when the court jester would be allowed to say things that ordinary people couldn't say in the presence of the prince and get away with it. And that's sort of the role I think that, well, certainly Johnny Carson played and Jack Parr, but all of the late night guys do that.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, I always think of comedians and comedy generally as sort of reflecting a point of view with a comedy slant. But really, it's really looking. These comedians are looking at society and regurgitating it for us, so that we can look at it from a different perspective. It's interesting you say you talk about comedians saying things they couldn't say. You know, we go back to Lenny Bruce,
Oh
who
yeah.
was arrested on stage
Hmm.
several times, or lots and lots of times.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward to television comedy on Carson, on Sullivan in those days. It had to be clean. They had to work clean, and they pretty much had to stay away from very controversial topics.
Hmm.
One exception to that, I always thought, was Richard Pryor. The first time I saw him on Ed Sullivan, I actually write about it a little bit in
Hmm.
the book. Um, he did a bit about being African American and, you know, having a tough time on the playground as a kid. And
Sure.
I thought, man, that is really, really smart. And it was very funny. But the point is, so that they had to work clean. Then HBO comes along and adopts comedy. And remember, HBO's whole pitch was uncut and uncensored. So now you get George Carlin and
Mm.
Robert Klein and Billy Crystal and Robin Williams and Whoopi Goldberg doing whatever they want, essentially. I mean, you know, I'm exaggerating. Those shows were very highly produced and rehearsed and everything else, but they could say what they wanted. They could use foul language. They could talk about verboten subjects, and that really moved comedy way ahead in terms of television.
And then you had, like, in a way, probably starting in the '90s, a sort of a almost a blurring of the lines between comedy and news in the case of Jon Stewart and so, in particular, and where people actually thought that he was a source for news, right? I mean, it was sort of
Yeah,
a
that's
different.
right. And that's a tribute. That's a tribute to, yes, the format, but it's also a tribute to John. I mean, he
Hmm.
was spectacular at it from the get-go.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I think that's partly because he's smart and he's empathetic, and he is a good person to deliver information, and he's very funny. So interesting you should bring it up, because Comedy Central had a history of comedy and news combination before The Daily Show. In 1992, we did our first, what we call the State of the Union Undressed. State of the Union Undressed, what we did is we took the State of the Union delivered by the president live. We took the live feed, and we had comedians commenting over it and making jokes and comments as the speech was going on. And that was kind of, you know, that was kind of unheard of. And it brought in a lot of young people to the State of the Union address who otherwise wouldn't have been there. And you'll never guess who was the first host of the State of the Union address.
I would not guess who.
Al
You.
Franken.
Ah, okay. Well, he was a writer for Saturday Night Live, and he was pushed the envelope. I mean, a lot of the skits that he wanted to do were not they were too racy for them, from what I understand.
Yeah.
And Saturday Night Live, of course, really almost institutionalized political satire. Um, but in my opinion, I think it's kind of gone too far with Trump, only because they seem to have lost his sense of humor. I mean, it's so nasty and so like overtly political that you know, at some level people think it's funny and they laugh because they think they're supposed to laugh, but it's not funny and it's backfiring on them, I think.
Well, I respect your opinion. It's hard for me to really say. I mean, what
Right.
people find funny in political humor is dependent on so many things, including your point of view on politics.
For sure.
So some people, as I said, they like the way their view of the world is reflected through that kind of comedy. And the people who don't view the world that way don't find it so funny. Whether
That's
you're
true.
getting tired of it or not is another story. I think we're all getting a little tired of politics, period. But 'tis the
Right.
season, right?
Oh, for sure. And also, ethnic humor is something that went way out of style, obviously, after World War II. You know, before then, you'd have people making comedy skits with Hitler. Um, but it kind of began to make a comeback, I think, with people like Jackie Mason, who could make fun of Jews because he was a Jew, and he could do it fun, very in a very kind of a positive way. But yet, at the same time, he was able to do criticism through a comedic lens. And I think since then, you have a lot of that. What do you think?
Um, I think ethnicity has been always been a large part of the comedy scene. I think that you mentioned Jackie Mason. I mean, you go back to the Borscht Belt comics, and he
Hmm.
was one of them. And most of them were Jewish, and they had all kinds of fun with
Yep.
their ethnicity and describing to their audience their lives, which reflected their audience's lives in very funny ways. I'm particularly fond of Alan King, actually, from that
Yes.
era.
Hmm.
And I think that another example, again, I mentioned it, is Pryor, Richard Pryor, who's,
Oh yeah.
got to be considered, if not one of the top five, the best stand-up comedian and one of the best comic talents ever. I mean, he was
Oh,
just
absolutely.
spectacular. He really, we could do an hour on Richard Pryor, and I'm not the world's foremost expert, but he went through a lot of different phases of examining the Black experience in America
He did.
based on his experience. And he not only communicated with the African American audience, but with everybody.
Oh yeah. And it was universal themes. I mean, which was ultimately what made it what it was. And plus, he was a trailblazer, and then he opened the door for black comedians, who have just learned from him and have continued it to this day. Um, you know,
Yeah, Red Fox and Mom's Mabley just had a heart attack when you said that.
uh,
they
well,
they preceded him by so much.
well, that's true. I mean, it goes way back, of course. I mean, but he kind of he was a breakthrough a
I take
figure.
your point.
Yep. So where do you think comedy is today?
I don't think comedy is very far from where it always has been. I mean, interestingly, Comedy Central is what, 30 years old?
Right.
That's a long time.
That's a big run.
That's a
Incredible.
big run for a comedy entity. Okay, now let's look at Saturday Night Live. I don't even know. What are they, 40 years old?
I
I
think
mean,
they started like late 70s. I remember
yeah,
the
right,
first
right.
I mean the first political thing they did was Chevy Chase making fun of Gerald Ford, right? And that was 75.
Right. So
And
my point is that's been around forever, and it's been a staple of comedy. As a matter of fact, at Comedy Central, that was one of the first acquisitions that we made. Was the library, was the SNL library, and previously those things had not been seen again.
oh, that must be
So
worth
we
a
bought
fortune
them.
today.
We put
Right.
I don't, to us, believe me, it was a fortune. I think we had to mortgage our souls to get that stuff, but it was very important to us because it was, an important part of comedy.
Of
But my
course.
point is, you got Comedy Central not surviving, thriving. You got Saturday Night Live is thriving. I mean, these are pretty much stakes in the ground for comedy. And then, some of the comedians today harken back to Seinfeld, I think, and some of the other comics are not, listen, there are comics who are really departing, and I am not an expert on today's comedy scene, but, some of the younger comics are not doing sort of the same kinds of things as Seinfeld does or did, but some of them are. So again, I think comedy reinvents itself constantly, but circles around the same place.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a mirror reflection of our society. It allows us to enjoy kind of a reportage that's not otherwise allowed in straight thinking, and that's important. It goes back. I mean, it's probably in ancient times they had comedians. I mean, it's an organic entity. It's an institution. So just to wrap it up, talk a little bit about your book. It's coming out in September. What are the highlights that we should expect?
Well, let me say that Constant Comedy, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor, is a memoir. Okay, so
Hmm.
it's really the story of getting Comedy Channel and Comedy Central up and running against incredible odds from my point of view. It's not, it all the aspects of it are there, I'm sure, but it's not a history as such. And it's
Okay.
certainly not an autobiography of me where talk about, oh, I was born in an early age, I grew up on the Jersey Shore. I mean, you there's a little bit of that, but mostly I am talking about from the time I pitched comedy to the time I left comedy, which was in the mid 90s, and fought how we fought to keep that channel alive when a lot of people thought it was failing and
Hmm.
not going to make it.
And I would imagine we can expect a lot of interesting sort of insights from the many people that you've rubbed shoulders with all those years.
It is a very good look behind the scenes at what was going on in comedy. Not
Hmm.
only what the performers were doing and thinking, which sometimes defied belief, but also just the machinations of putting together a channel when you have on one side a group of talent who wants to do all kinds of things, and on the other side you have businessmen. Our bosses who were in this for the money. I mean, yes,
Hmm.
they liked comedy and they thought it was a good idea, but they wanted to make sure that this thing was successful. And it was sometimes those things were at cross purposes. So it's really that story.
I understand. And it seems to me, Art, that you were able to merge those two elements as an economist and as a great admirer of comedy. You had both sides of the brain working together. So, that's what it took to make a business. But I mean, my final question here is why did you lose your sense of humor?
Well, that goes directly to the first few months after we launched.
Hmm.
Um, Almost immediately after we launched, and everybody was on the edge of their seats to see comedy, see the comedy channel that HBO was putting together. But almost immediately after we launched, we got creamed by the critics,
Uh,
panned by everybody. And 3 months into it, we started to develop an audience, but it wasn't going all that great, I got to tell you. And
mm,
when we were called in, I was called in by with a couple of other guys by the chairman of HBO, Michael Fuchs, and he looked at us and he said, it took a comedy channel to get me to lose my sense of humor.
no. He
And
wasn't
nobody,
exactly he wasn't exactly rolling in the aisles at that meeting.
it, it, and I looked around, nobody was laughing. And I
Yeah.
realized at that moment we lost our sense of humor. But that's, I really wanted to express how difficult this whole thing was.
Yeah. Well, then I'm looking forward to the book, Art, and it should be out on the bookshelves in September. Art Bell is
It is it is
no,
available for pre
oh, so then it's already
now on
available on
Amazon.
Amazon?
So you can look it up.
Excellent.
Yes,
Okay, so
for
Art Bell's
pre-order.
pre-order on Amazon then. Art Bell's the author of the memoir Constant Comedy: How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. Listen, Art, I really want to thank you for joining me today.
Uh, Thank thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right, have a good